Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the Piedmont region of North Carolina. At this point, we have already done Tidewater and Coastal Plain and the Sandhill subregion of the Coastal Plain. And you can see in this area, this is the Piedmont of North Carolina. I want to point out a couple of things on this map. I want you to look at these little dark spaces that you're seeing in the coastal plain, and you see them. They're more apparent in the Piedmont region. And what this is this is telling you that the elevation of North Carolina as we move across increases. So you can see how there are no dark spots on the landscape of the Tidewater and this part of the coastal plain. But as we begin to move over towards the west, you start to see those higher elevations coming in, and they become more and more and more close together the further we get west. So this just means we're getting into, again, higher elevations in North Carolina. So if we were to compare this part of Piedmont, if we could pull it over and put it right beside over top of the Tidewater. So imagine we're grabbing it and we're pulling the Piedmont over, and we compare the Piedmont of North Carolina to the actual ocean. You're going to see that this is several hundred feet above sea level, working on ways up when we get into the mountains to being 1, 2, 3, 4, even 6,000 feet above sea level. That becomes a little bit more apparent when we get into the mountain region of North Carolina. I also want to note this red line is called the fall line, and it divides the coastal plain and the Piedmont, and we'll look at it in this section and learn a little bit about it, but I want to make sure you know where it's at for when we come back and talk about it. And it's called the fall line because it has to deal with these the differences in the elevation between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. But I'll explain it again in a few minutes. So the Piedmont is known for hills, those rising elevations, not mountains yet. We're not mountains, but hills, and red clay. I'm going to go back to this map for just a second, and I want to point out where Harnett County is at. Harnett County is mostly coastal plain, but there is a part of it that lies within the Piedmont region. And so when you get out and you start riding in these western parts of North Carolina, you may start seeing more of these hilly areas. And if you were to get on a road and continue to travel, you would see it more and more and more and more. The hills would get even bigger the further west we go. It also has a lot of red clay soil. And so when we say red clay soil, we're talking about red top dirt. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, think about like a baseball field. And baseball fields tend to have clay soil in them. They put it out there in baseball fields often because it packs really hard. It's harder than regular dirt. And it doesn't really hold water the same way that regular dirt does. And so think about that type of soil that I'm talking about. Most of the major cities in North Carolina are located in the Piedmont region, such as Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Winston-Salem. All of those can be found in the Piedmont region. The word Piedmont itself means foothills of the mountains. It is a Native American term. And it's called this because that is the region of North Carolina that is right near the backside of the mountains, or right at what they call the foot of the mountains. Rivers connected western North Carolina with South Carolina, resulting in something called sectionalism. Again, I'm going to back this up because I like being able to point it out on the map. This map, of course, doesn't have any rivers on it. But most of the rivers in this section of North Carolina, they don't flow from west to east or from east to west. They flow kind of down through the Piedmont region and down into South Carolina. And why this is important is because back when people first settled in North Carolina and started moving throughout the state, it wasn't a state at the time, it was just a colony. They would travel largely by rivers, and they got on rivers and they traveled wherever that river took them. And so if that river took them south, and you have to remember that none of these borders were here. It was just all of this was not really divided up the way it is, but people living in this area, these areas, would get on rivers and they would travel, and those rivers would take them into what we call South Carolina today. And so the people of this region ended up interacting more with people down in here. They didn't really interact with people from here between the Piedmont and the coastal plain or Tidewater. Not too much. They did some, but not too much. And it was simply because of the rivers. The rivers in the coastal plain tend to go out toward the Tidewater region. Some do go down into this part of South Carolina, but coastal plain tends to go into Tidewater. Tidewater, they tend to go into either the sounds up in here or down into the Atlantic Ocean, such as Cape Fear River. And so this created what was called sectionalism. Sectionalism as in two sections or separate sections. And so the people in the Piedmont region didn't really interact with the people in the coastal plain and Tidewater region, and vice versa. They didn't really interact too much. And so they really didn't know each other that well. It created different customs and cultures. And so it would end up eventually causing some issues later on that we'll get into. Over one half of the region of the Piedmont region is forest. There used to be a lot more forest than what there is, but a lot of that has been cut down. But there's still a lot of forest out in the area. Farms and factories. Poor soil in the Piedmont region, that clay soil, was made difficult for farming. It's really hard to grow anything in that red soil because it, like I said, that's why they use it in baseball fields, because it gets really hard and it packs down and it doesn't really hold water. I want you to think about the consistency. If you've ever played with Play-Doh or something along the lines of that, some type of clay, it doesn't absorb water. If you were to let's say you would make a clay bowl, if you took some Play-Doh or something and you were to make it like a little teeny tiny bowl out of it or something, and you pour water into it, it's going to sit there for a while. Eventually it would make its way through it. It would probably eventually leak through it, but it's going to sit in that bowl for a little while before it leaks through it. And that's what made it so hard for farmers, because the water would not seep down into the dirt to get to the roots of the plant. And also when it dries out, it hardens really hard and the roots can't grow through it. So the soil in the Piedmont region was difficult to farm. It was not good soil like we have in the coastal plain, where the coastal plain was the best region for farming, of course. And so the soil was very different. So people still wanted to farm that moved to the Piedmont region and who lived in the Piedmont region. So they chose to farm above the ground instead of in the ground. And what I mean by that is they didn't plant seeds and plants down in the ground. They did a little, but not too much. But what the kind of farming they did was they got into more of having livestock, such as cows and horses and pigs. And that created a lot of dairy farms. Dairy farms is farms with cows where milk comes from. So that was a lot of what that land in the Piedmont region was used for. As time moved on, they got more into having a lot of factories in those big cities. But in the 1990s, the industry began to decline because the U.S. government changed some of the ways things were done, the way trade was done. It was called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and that was changed under President Bill Clinton. And he signed this, and when he signed and passed this law that was passed, or bill that was passed, it allowed more trade between the United States and other countries. And when that happened, they started outsourcing the factory owners started outsourcing a lot of the work to other countries where they could get people to work cheaper and build things cheaper. And so it actually caused a lot of factories in the United States, especially the Southeast, was hit hard with it. And so I can tell you in Irwin, my brother-in-law actually lost his job. He used to work in a textile plant in Irwin, North Carolina. It was a cotton factory that made denim, and he lost his job because it was outsourced to another country. And so textiles and furniture factories began moving to other countries, and lots of people lost their jobs. But banking and high-tech industry began to grow in North Carolina around that time. Well, in the Piedmont region and throughout. This is that clay so that you can get a look at it. That is Pilot Mountain, North Carolina in the background. Somebody is growing a little bit of what looks like burley. What's called burley tobacco here. Doesn't grow near as well in this kind of soil as it does here. This one particular one will grow okay there. But you can see we don't really have much soil that looks like this in Harnett County. There's a few places that you may see it, or you dig far enough down in the ground and you come across a little bit. But this right here is what a lot of the Piedmont is. And so yes, things can grow in it, but it makes it really hard for things like corn and things like that to grow in it. So farmers go with cows, and these are what I call little bitty baby moo cows because I think they're so cute. This is Winston-Salem, and this is Charlotte, North Carolina. That looks like it might be the Panther Stadium. I'm not for sure. That's kind of what it looks like it might be. I'm not for sure. The Piedmont Crescent, you can see here. There used to be a train that ran through this region of North Carolina through the Piedmont. Here's Harnett County, and up here is Wake County, where's Raleigh, and there used to be a train that traveled through this area. And that train formed what was sort of called a crescent. This is a crescent. A crescent is like a half moon shape. And if you kind of look, you can kind of sort of see it there on the map. So between Raleigh around to the major cities to Charlotte, and that's what really helped those cities to move to build up, was that there were trains that moved through there, and those trains were often hauling things like lumber or trees to make lumber, or it was moving things that cotton that goes into some factories that was changing it into denim, for example. Now, the Irwin, the denim plant that I spoke of earlier, is not in this region, but it is down here in Harnett County, and so not too far from that. So the factories and towns grew along this crescent route. Eventually, some of the train would tend to die out, but because of that was such a widely traveled area, and so many there were what was called train depots where the trains would stop and load and unload. That's where those major cities built up, and eventually Interstate 85. It's an actual interstate that you drive on, grew in that crescent route or crescent route that forms along from Raleigh to Charlotte. Modern development, things that you find in Charlotte, in the Piedmont region. Charlotte is considered to be a national banking center of the United States, really. And this is where NASCAR began. If you're into race cars or you know somebody in your family that's into race cars, NASCAR actually got its start in Charlotte, North Carolina. Winston-Salem and Durham are big in medical service. They have hospitals and colleges to teach all different subjects, but they really focus a lot on doctors and nurses. Because of their hospitals there. Groceries got their start there. So the grocery industry in North Carolina. Food Line is actually headquartered in North Carolina. So was Harris Teeter and Lowe's. Those are based out of North Carolina. So that means that that's where they got started at. You may find them in other states, but that's where they got started at. That's where they're headquartered. at. So when we say headquartered, we mean that's where their main office is at. Krispy Kreme is also headquartered in Piedmont in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So Krispy Kreme was born out of North Carolina, and a lot of people don't necessarily know that it was created and grew out of North Carolina. And an area called the Research Triangle Park, or RTP, which is a leader in pharmaceuticals and computers, can be found, and that connects Durham, Raleigh, and Chapel Hill. If you look at it on a map, it forms, if you draw a line from Durham, Raleigh, and Chapel Hill, it kind of forms the shape of a triangle, and that is where a lot of research goes into medicine, and a lot of computer programming and such things as that. And this is goes back to that Charlotte, the NASCAR thing. And Charlotte there was a book called Bank Town, The Rise and Struggles of Charlotte's Big Banks. And here is a picture of the Wake Forest Medical Center that I mentioned earlier, and Duke University Medical Center. Food Line and Harris Teeter, and some yummy Krispy Kreme donuts. And here is the image I was mentioning. So you have Durham, Chapel Hill, and Raleigh. And so if you draw a map right on those, it does kind of sort of form a triangle. And there is a lot of research and creations and looking into the medical field that goes on there. Now, I want to focus on this foul line. This was what I mentioned when we first got started, and I said I want you to see that the foul line cuts down through the middle of Coastal Plain and the Piedmont. So you remember where that red line was at, and I want you to look at it on this. So this is the Piedmont region of North Carolina, and this is the Coastal Plain, and down in here would be kind of sort of the Tidewater would be here, Coastal Plain would be up in here. And I told you that as you move from east to west, look how North Carolina goes up in elevation. So this is the ocean, Tidewater, it's going up when you hit the Coastal Plain, and it goes up really far from Coastal Plain into Piedmont, and then it keeps continuing going up to the highest elevations. Okay, well, look right through here where we went up, way up really fast right here. Well, what goes up must come down. So if we're looking at it from this way, I want you to think about rivers and streams. And I told you that a lot of them the rivers go out of North Carolina, but we do have streams and some rivers that come from the Piedmont into the Coastal Plain. So there is a pretty sudden drop between the Piedmont and the Coastal Plain. So wherever there's rivers along this drop, it creates waterfalls. And so this is called the foul line. A lot of people like to go here and take like kayaks and things like that and ride rapids in this area. That's something that's pretty well known for. Rapids is the fast water that's coming down. Like you wouldn't necessarily want to come over this in a canoe because that would be dangerous. But when you get down here, when that water hits down here, it does create a lot of rapids in this area. But that's what the foul line is. It's basically where water from the Piedmont falls into the Coastal Plain because there's such a swift, quick drop that it creates a lot of waterfalls, or not, I would say waterfalls, but also just, like I mentioned earlier, rapids. And this is an example of what we're talking about. So if you couldn't grasp what I meant when I said waterfall, this is what we're talking about. This is just a very beautiful waterfall where you can see there's a quick shift in elevation and water is falling from the Piedmont into Coastal Plain areas.